Welcome to Invested in Climate. Protecting the planet and decarbonizing the global economy is the challenge of our time. We all have a role to play, and the opportunity we face is unprecedented. Invested in Climate aims to help people do more to address climate change through their work, investments, lifestyle, and activism. I'm your host, Jason Rissman. I support a growing community of top climate and ESG leaders as the Chief Experience Officer at Nationswell, and I'm an advisor to the climate practice at IDEO. I'm also an investor and startup advisor, and when it comes to climate action, I know I'll be a lifelong learner, always looking to have more impact. If you like what you hear, give us a good rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you found us. Sign up for updates and suggest ideas for future episodes at investedinclimate.com. Follow us on social, subscribe, and spread the word. Thanks for joining.
There's this huge pool of latent political power out there for the climate movement that isn't showing up on election day. There are these millions of non-voting Americans who do care deeply about climate, but they're not impacting policymaking simply because they ain't showing up on election day. And that's what we're trying to change at the Environmental Voter Project.
Hey folks, we're just weeks away from a historic election. It's one that will decide the course of climate action in the United States at a pivotal moment, a moment when we can't afford to slow down or send mixed signals abroad. And it's an election that all expect to be decided by just tens of thousands of voters. These are all facts that I'm sure you already know. Here's what you probably don't know. There are millions of environmentalists who don't vote. These are people who list the environment and climate change as their number one most important issue. And getting just 1% to 2% of them to vote could easily decide the election. This is the premise and work of the Environmental Voter Project. They're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization not focusing on a particular party, but instead focusing on protecting the environment simply by getting environmentalists to the polls. I learned a lot from my conversation with EVP founder and executive director Nathaniel Stinnett. We talked about the difference between voter preferences and voter priorities, who these non-voting environmentalists are, and what actually works in getting them to vote. The answer to that riddle and much else in this episode might surprise you. Lots to learn and think about in this one. Enjoy. Nathaniel, welcome to Invested in Climate. So glad to have you here today.
Oh, thank you, Jason. I'm really excited for this.
Well, I know it's an extremely busy moment for you, so thanks for taking the time to be here. We're here to talk about the election and your organization, Environmental Voters Project. Let's dive straight into the heart of the matter. When it comes to climate and environmental progress, what's at stake in the 2024 election?
What isn't at stake? I mean, first of all, just talking about the politics, and then we'll get to the policy that flows out of the politics. The White House is at stake. The U.S. House is at stake, where Republicans currently have an 8-seat majority, a very small majority. The Senate is at stake, where Democrats only have a 51 to 49 majority. The future of the Supreme Court is at stake. Many would claim, and I think they're probably right, that maybe the future of democracy is at stake. But closer to home, talking about climate and environmental issues, the policy that flows out of not just the federal elections that are taking place, but also the state and local elections, means that countless lives are at stake that depend on a livable climate with clean air and clean water. All we need to do is look at the last 2 presidential elections to realize, Jason, that this is going to be really close. Donald Trump only beat Hillary Clinton by 77,000 votes in 3 states. And then 4 years later, Joe Biden only beat Donald Trump by 43,000 votes in 3 states. So much is at stake politically and for climate and environmental policy, and it's going to be decided by a handful of people in a handful of states.
What about the implications for climate? Our presidential candidates have very different records and views on the environment. So tell us a bit just how you see the issue of the environment and climate being influenced by the election.
We can get into the nitty-gritty of specific laws and legislation, but oftentimes I think that clouds the far more important stuff, which is when we talk about climate change and when we talk about environmental issues like clean air and clean water, we are literally talking about people's lives, their health, and their jobs. So let's just talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. I believe it has already created over 300,000 brand new clean energy jobs. That's more than the entire US coal industry, even if you include like coal mining and transportation and power plant jobs. The Inflation Reduction Act is creating clean school buses and giving people tax credits for electric vehicles. And perhaps most importantly, it's eliminating hundreds of thousands of asthma attacks for little kids, and it's reducing the number of lost work days. These are the things that are at stake. And I say this not to imply that like everybody should support X law or Y law, but just to give you an idea of what the stakes are. These are human lives, and these are jobs that are going to be up for grabs if we go backwards or if we change course in the future. And then at a more scientific level, I'll just say, Jason, and I'm not a scientist, so forgive me, I'm going to speak in very broad terms here. I'm going to use sort of the analogy of a foot race or something. Science tells us that the climate crisis is moving much, much faster than our politics is. And that's even after 4 years of historic climate legislation. So we need to be speeding up. The physics is clear. We need to speed up when it comes to leading on climate change. And the last thing we can afford is to either slow down or stand still or, dear God, move backwards. And that's not a political statement. That's physics. This is what we need to confront heading into the next 4 years.
Nathaniel, you mentioned at the beginning that it's not just about national elections, but also that local elections matter too. Tell us how local elections influence environmental policy.
Climate policy isn't just made on the national level. It's also made on the state level, where utilities are regulated and mass transit is funded. And on the local level, where zoning and traffic codes are drafted and our next generation of buildings are being approved or denied. Even just looking at what will happen this coming November, we've got state legislatures that are just decided by a handful of seats right now that will be decided in places like Pennsylvania and Michigan and New Hampshire and Arizona. We've got state utility regulators, so often called public utility commissions or public service commissions, being voted on across the country. And then down at the local level, there are local utility boards being elected in places like Nebraska and Kansas, which might not seem like a very big deal on a global scale, but it is. These local utility boards, many of them own power plants. And so you change one or two members on a local elected utility board, and you might be able to shut down a coal-fired power plant, literally saving thousands of people's lives. So these are the really, really impactful elections that are going to be taking place this November on a local and state level, and you probably won't see them covered on CNN, but they're still incredibly important for climate policymaking.
Nathaniel, to you and I, and to probably most of our listeners, I'm sure these stakes feel incredibly important. But I want to shift to understanding public sentiment on the environment. Based upon how little we hear about climate and the environment, it's easy to believe that Americans just don't care about the environment and care about voting for it that much. Is that true?
It's a very good question, Jason. And I'm going to be kind of annoying, and I'm going to answer, well, sort of. And this is what I mean by, well, sort of. There's an enormous difference between voter preferences and voter priorities, right? So you could look at polling data and you'll see that enormous majorities of Americans would prefer that their politicians lead on climate. So when you ask, do Americans care about the environment? Well, yeah, if you define care as would they prefer their elected leaders to lead on climate, yeah, a lot of them do. But if instead of looking at voter preferences, we look at voter priorities, so things that are really, really important to voters, well, far, far fewer of them. I mean, we're talking about, depending on the poll, anywhere from like 3 to 7% of Americans list climate change as their number one priority. And that's a really important distinction to make because we don't vote based on our preferences. I mean, my guess is that many of your listeners would love to like get rid of daylight savings time. That is their preference, but it's probably not a high priority of theirs, right? They're probably not going into the voting booth on election day and deciding who to vote for president based on like their feelings about daylight savings time. It is not a high priority of theirs. And that's similar, unfortunately, to how Americans view the climate crisis. So many of us would prefer that our elected leaders address it, but very, very few of us prioritize that and have it top of mind when we go in to vote. And that's a lot of the reason why we see so few politicians leading on climate.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Great distinction between voter preference and voter prioritization. And I read that on your website, only 4% of voters in battleground states list climate change as a top voting issue. How does that play out with the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so this brings up the other important distinction to make when we're talking about public opinion and climate change. So the first is this distinction between voter preferences and voter priorities. The second is the distinction between voters and non-voters. As you could probably imagine, Jason, politicians are in the business of winning elections. And so they care a hell of a lot more about the priorities of voters than they do about the priorities of non-voters. Because when it comes down to it, non-voters don't get to decide who wins and loses elections. Only voters do. And yeah, when we look at likely voters, at people who are likely to show up in battleground states or even outside of battleground states, far, far too few of them list climate as a top priority. And you referenced data showing that in a recent poll, we found that only 4% did. But here's the really interesting thing that gets at our work at the Environmental Voter Project. When you look at less likely voters, so people who tend to not show up and cast ballots, depending on the state, many more of them do prioritize climate and the environment. And this is a really important distinction to make because it reveals that there's this huge pool of latent political power out there for the climate movement that isn't showing up on election day. There are these millions of non-voting Americans who do care deeply about climate, but they're not impacting policymaking simply because they ain't showing up on election day. And that's what we're trying to change at the Environmental Voter Project.
Well, let's go deeper into that because you described earlier presidential elections that are being decided by tens of thousands of voters. And what you're saying is that there's millions of people who maybe consider themselves environmentalists or at least care a lot about the environment and would be responsive to environmentally focused candidates, but they're not showing up. Tell us more. How many actually? Is it really millions? And what do you know about them?
It is millions, Jason. It is millions. So let's just take what we're looking at right now in our data. The Environmental Voter Project is active in 19 states, so not even half of the country, 19 states. In just those 19 states, we have identified 4.8 million Americans who all fit the following criteria. 1, they're already registered to vote. 2, they are highly likely to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally list it as their number one priority over all other issues. Yet 3, they did not vote in the 2020 presidential election or any election since then. So that's 4.8 million low propensity, which means they're unlikely to vote, climate voters in just 19 states. That is a huge, huge number. And we're talking about really important states here. We're talking about Pennsylvania, Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina, Georgia, Texas, Florida. These people are not in weird, like politically unimportant states. They are in crucially important states. And yeah, they could make a huge difference if they just start showing up.
What else does your research tell us about them? Why are so many folks that are motivated by the environment listed as a top issue? So they're engaged in the world, they understand the challenges that we're facing. Why are they not voting?
Yeah, that's a good question. Why aren't they voting? Well, first, let me tell you what we don't know before we get to what we do know, because I think it's important to be clear about where we have precision and where we don't have precision. Social scientists are really good at setting up experiments that tell them how to get people to do things. What they're not terribly good at is figuring out why people don't do things, like, say, voting. Really, the only tool social science has when you're trying to figure out, hey, why isn't someone voting, or why aren't they buying this product, or why aren't they exercising, is to ask them, is to poll them. And when you ask people why they aren't doing something that society views as important, they lie their pants off. It's called social desirability bias, right? You ask them, hey, why aren't you doing this thing that deep down they know they're supposed to do? And what they tend to do is just give you what they think is the most socially acceptable excuse for not voting. So,
Too busy?
yeah, I mean, sometimes they'll say too busy, or sometimes they'll say politicians don't care about the things that I care about. But for a whole bunch of reasons, Jason, we don't think you should trust those responses because of this social desirability bias that always takes place. And because most of the reasons that people give for not voting are also things that really good voters believe too. And so we have a whole lot of reason to doubt whether those excuses are causally related to not voting. Okay, I just gave you like the world's biggest caveat. So let me now actually answer your question here and tell you what we do know about these environmentalists not voting. First is a really strong demographic correlation that's going on here. So people who are likely to list climate or other environmental issues as their number one priority are disproportionately young, and they're disproportionately people of color. And those are two groups that already vote less often, partially because they're the object of most voter suppression efforts. If you go anywhere in the United States, if someone is making it harder for a group of people to vote, chances are they're targeting either young people or people of color. And that right there is the beating heart of the modern environmental movement. So that's one thing that's going on that's leading to depressed turnout among environmentalists. But it's not the only thing, because even when you look just at a particular demographic group, like young people, the ones who care about the environment vote less often. Or even if you just look at Black voters, the ones who care about the environment vote less often. And what we think is going on there is the climate movement and the broader environmental movement for decades has been weirdly apolitical. By which I mean, if you ask people how they address climate change or what they do to fight against climate change, the first 3 or 5 or maybe even 10 things that they are likely to say, Jason, have to do with their own personal behavior. They're going to say things like, oh, I eat less meat, or I ride my bike to work, or I'm changing the electricity I consume, all of which are really important, but they are weirdly apolitical. Like, you would never, ever hear someone who's concerned about mass shootings talk like that. You would never hear someone who's concerned about reproductive rights talk that way. I mean, if you care about reproductive rights, you know that this is a systemic political issue that requires a systemic political solution. But we in the climate movement haven't internalized that yet. We still view the climate crisis as like this personal failure that we can only address in the privacy of our own homes by changing our own personal behavior, which is, of course, absurd, but that's how most people view it. And I think that's a big reason why environmentalists don't typically view voting and other political avenues as an obvious solution to the climate crisis.
Well, Nathaniel, we know that this isn't an accident. It's well documented that the whole idea of the personal carbon footprint was actually invented by British Petroleum as part of an advertising campaign 20 years ago. And fossil fuel companies have spent billions in influencing how we think about the environment. Are you able to see how these campaigns actually influence voting?
Absolutely, Jason. And I'm so glad you brought that up. It's hard to draw a direct causal relationship between those fossil fuel PR campaigns and why environmentalists vote less often. But it is clear that we have bought that line, that PR line from the fossil fuel industry, hook, line, and sinker. We think that climate change is our own fault. And we don't think about, like, oh, maybe I just change the member of the Public Utility Commission so they can shut down the coal-fired power plant rather than worrying about whether I bought too many plastic water bottles. We have absolutely internalized this. And yes, it is affecting the way millions of environmentalists engage politically, or more often, don't engage politically.
All right, Nathaniel, you've gotten me heated up here. We've got
Good.
almost 5 million folks who categorize climate and environment as their number one voting issue just across 19 states. What do you do about that? Tell us a bit about Environmental Voter Project and what you're learning, not just about those voters, but how to actually engage them.
First, I want to just be clear that this is the only type of voters we focus on. I like to say that we are in the behavior changing business, not the mind changing business. So the Environmental Voter Project doesn't try to create more climate voters by changing people's opinions. We don't go out and try to convince people to care about climate change. That's important, but oh my God, is it hard and expensive, and we want to leave that to other groups. Instead, we want to be in the behavior change business. So we're laser focused on these millions of people who already care deeply about climate. They don't need issue education. They don't need persuasion. They don't need their minds changed. They just are awful voters, and so they need a behavioral intervention. What we do then with these people is we individually identify them by building these predictive models on voter files. So we'll poll tens of thousands of people, isolate the ones who say climate's their number one priority, and then work with data scientists to find other people like them. And it's a long iterative process, but at the end of it, we can really precisely identify individuals who are likely to list climate as their top priority, yet we know from their public voting records that they're not voting. Then we need to go in and mobilize them. And the way that we do that is we work with thousands of volunteers around the country. Like last I checked, we now have over 7,000 volunteers across the country. And we're door-to-door canvassing to talk to these voters. We're calling them. We're sending them postcards. And then we, as a staff, are also running direct mail and digital ad campaigns. And we probably run hundreds of experiments each year, figuring out which messages work best with which subgroups of these non-voting environmentalists, just to do one thing and one thing only, and that is turn them into first-time voters. And we've gotten really, really good at this. We're going to be using all of these interventions, canvassing, calling, mailing, and digital ads on those 4.8 million non-voting environmentalists across 19 states this fall.
So what works? You're reaching out to these voters with a variety of experiments and lots of different messages. What have you found to be the most resonant, persuasive, helpful message to actually motivate that behavior change?
Yeah, so here's the really weird, counterintuitive thing, Jason. We do not talk about climate or the environment.
What?
Yeah, I know. Not because we don't enjoy talking about it. I love talking about it in my free time. But we have found that if you're in the behavior change space, so again, remember, we're not trying to convince people to care more about climate. If you're simply trying to get someone's butt out the door on election day who already cares about climate, talking about issues does not work. In fact, if you look at it sort of in a broader, more theoretical sense, what behavioral scientists have come to realize over the past few decades is if you're trying to change someone's behavior, you should not treat them as a rational animal. You should not try to rationally convince them of the value of whatever action you're trying to get them to take. Instead, you should view them as social animals and use things like peer pressure or other social norms to nudge them into becoming better voters. So what does that mean in actual messages? Well, we'll use things like FOMO, fear of missing out, where we'll reach out to these voters and we'll say, hey, each year, more and more of your peers are voting. So don't be left behind, Jason. Everybody's voting this year. If you don't cast a ballot, like you might be the last person left alone in the middle of your street not having voted. And oh my God, does it work well? We will even use less subtle forms of peer pressure where we'll call people up and we'll say, hey, did you know last time there was a presidential election, 127 people on your block of Main Street showed up to vote? It sounds juvenile because, like, it is. It's the kind of thing you would hear on, like, the third grade playground. But it works because we're social animals and we're always looking around at our peers to try to figure out what is acceptable behavior and what is unacceptable behavior. And so what we do at the Environmental Voter Project is we try to reinforce as many norms as possible that people buy into that make them more likely to vote. And to give you just a final example of this, because it works tremendously well, we will knock on people's doors, ask if they intend to vote. Now, most people will be embarrassed and they'll say yes, even though we know that they're not voters, or else we wouldn't be talking to them, right? And what that then allows us to do is come back to them and have a conversation right before Election Day and say, hey, Jason, I just want to remind you, a few months ago, you spoke to one of my colleagues and you said that you were going to vote. And well, the election is on Tuesday, and that's your opportunity to follow through on your promise. And I know it's important to you to be someone who keeps their promises. And now, instead of me trying to convince you of the value of your one vote over a denominator of millions, I'm equating the act of voting with whether you're an honest person who keeps his promises or not. And that's so much more powerful in changing your behavior than trying to bring you through a cost-benefit analysis of whether it's worthwhile to vote or not.
Fascinating. Tell us about the results. Seemingly through the experimentation, you know that this works. So give us a sense of what have you been able to achieve as you've been doing this for several years now?
Yeah, so we measure our impact in two ways. One is in specific one-off elections, and the other is over the long term. So in specific one-off elections, what we do is we run randomized control trials. I won't get into the minutia of what randomized control trials are, but just very briefly, it means that we set aside a control group of unlikely to vote environmentalists, and we never talk to them. Then we deliver our messages to the other part, the other group of non-voting environmentalists, and then after the election, we can compare turnout in those two groups. And that enables us to isolate what our sole impact was on turnout while controlling for all outside variables like other campaigns and weather and things like that. And what we've seen in these randomized control trials is that we can be solely responsible for increasing turnout among our targets by as much as 1.8 percentage points in general elections, 3.6 percentage points in statewide primaries, and 5.7 percentage points in local elections. And those might not sound like big numbers, but those are enormous in politics. I mean, 1% is everything in politics. And then over the longer term, we've tracked every individual unique voter who we've ever communicated with, and we tag them in our voter file and track their voting habits. And since we launched, we have now communicated with 10.5 million unique individual voters, all of whom care deeply about climate and the environment and had an awful voting history, or else we wouldn't be talking to them, right? Well, as of a few months ago, we saw that of those 10.5 million, 1.8 million had become such consistent voters that they had voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and even their most recent local election. They had become such good voters that, like, Jason, if you were running for dog catcher, you would look at the voter file and you'd be like, oh, yep, got to talk to that person. They always vote. Got to go to their door, got to figure out what issues they care about. These people, they're now first-class citizens. They are now driving policymaking across the board.
Nathaniel, back to this year and this year's important election. What are you hoping to achieve?
I will never predict what our results are going to be because there are obviously a gazillion different variables. But we have seen in really high turnout elections like this that we are able to increase turnout, be solely responsible for increasing turnout among our targets by as much as 1 or 1.5 percentage points. And so if we're targeting almost 5 million voters across these 19 states, that means that we could end up being solely responsible for bringing 75,000 brand new climate first voters off the sidelines who otherwise would not have shown up if it weren't for the Environmental Voter Project. And many of them are in crucially important states like Pennsylvania and Arizona and Georgia. But moreover, I would say this, Jason, we are standing on the shoulders of all of the work that our thousands of volunteers and staff members have done over the past few years. Because remember, we're not just about impacting one-off elections. We're also looking to slowly but surely build up the power of the climate electorate. And all of these voters who we've been speaking to year in, year out in all of these states, well, many of them we're not even talking to anymore because they've become consistent voters and they no longer need an organization like us to mobilize them. Yet, it's like this return on investment tale that just keeps on going year after year. These are super voters who in many ways we're responsible for, yet we no longer need to spend our time and energy on them. And so those voters will also be making a difference this year. And finally, after November 5th, we're going to go right back to work and continue talking to these low propensity environmental voters. All the work that we're doing even this fall won't just disappear into nothingness once we roll into next winter. We're going to make sure that these people show up in next year's municipal and state elections too. And so it's this kind of positive feedback loop where the past and the present and the future are all coming together, and we're just slowly building the power of this huge electoral block that's going to make it a lot easier for politicians to lead on climate.
Nathaniel, you mentioned the dependence on your thousands of volunteers. Give us a sense of the sensitivity analysis for the organization and the work that you're doing. What are the big dependencies or the big factors that will determine whether or not you achieve or surpass or fall short of your goals?
We have already individually identified all of our voter targets in like the creepiest sense imaginable, right? Like we know them by name and street address. We have their phone number. We can deliver digital ads to them. We have already run hundreds of randomized control trials, isolating what messages to deliver to which subgroups of those non-voting environmentalists. So now, Jason, all that's left, the only variables that will determine how successful we are how much money we raise and how many volunteers we can deploy. It's just those two things. Just those two things. And to give you a sense of what sort of the range of outcomes is there, we have, at this moment in time, with about a month and a half, 2 months left until Election Day, we want to raise another maybe $1.1 million to meet our budget. But by looking at past randomized control trials, we're pretty confident that we could bring in another $5.2 million before we even reach a point of diminishing returns on our expenditures. So we can scale, even now, even this late in the game, pretty dramatically. To get to the volunteers, we have a whole bunch of volunteers, over 7,000, who consistently volunteer with us. But we are going to be looking to fill 12 or 13,000 shifts, volunteer shifts. Usually they're 2-hour shifts between now and Election Day. This is door-to-door canvassing and phone banking. And so that's a big, big lift. But what I can say is anybody who volunteers for us, they will get all the training they need over Zoom. And I can guarantee that they'll be given a script that has been proven to work in a previous experiment when it comes to increasing turnout among environmental voters. And that's a really wonderful thing to be able to offer to volunteers, to be able to say, we will give you all the training you need, and then you will be using a script that has been guaranteed to work in the past.
Okay, so your success depends on internal factors like more or less your capacity and your resources. Of course, there's external factors too. Having a top of ticket candidate that appeals more to young people and people of color is probably a helpful thing. And I know that you recently did some research on the attitudes of young people in swing states. So tell us about the findings of that research.
Yes. So I want to be clear. We're a nonpartisan organization. We don't endorse candidates or oppose particular candidates or support particular candidates. But we, as you mentioned, did do battleground state polling among 18 to 34-year-old registered voters. And we saw a whole bunch of really interesting things, but I'll just mention a few right off the bat here. One, Kamala Harris has turned Joe Biden's weakness with young voters into an enormous advantage. So on average, across the 5 battleground states that we polled, Joe Biden has a minus 13 net favorability rating. What that means is his unfavorable rating is 13 points higher than his favorable rating. So he has a negative 13 net favorability rating. Donald Trump has a negative 9 favorability rating. Kamala Harris has a plus 16 net favorability rating. And in some states like Nevada, it's plus 21, and it's plus 20 in Georgia. So Joe Biden's weakness and Donald Trump's weakness has become Kamala Harris's enormous strength. So that's one really interesting thing that we're seeing among young voters. Another thing that I want to pull out, because obviously we're a climate and environmental organization, is we did a lot of polling around climate and environmental opinions. And we saw, Jason, that young voters, even young Republicans, would prefer to vote for candidates who prioritize addressing climate change. And the way we got to this was we presented the people we polled with a hypothetical primary election. So we said to Democrats, we said, okay, imagine there's a Democratic primary. Would you prefer to vote for a candidate who addresses prioritizing climate change or a candidate who prioritizes fossil fuel expansion? Well, Democrat, perhaps unsurprisingly, went 82 to 13, so 82% to 13%, and then a few undecided, for candidates who prioritized addressing climate change. Maybe that's not surprising. But what's really interesting was when we looked at young Republicans and asked them the same thing about a Republican primary, 46% said they would prefer Republican candidates who prioritize climate change. 43% said they would prefer Republican candidates who want to expand fossil fuel production. Now, I want to be clear, we probably wouldn't have seen results like that if we had also polled middle-aged and older Republicans, but this shows that there are a whole bunch of young Republicans who are eager for their party to lead on climate.
Nathaniel, I'm curious how you feel about the fact that the most effective strategy for engaging environmental voters is to not actually talk about the environment. Does it matter that the environment doesn't get more explicit attention? And what do you think needs to happen for it to be something that we actually talk about more?
Well, it matters that climate and the environment doesn't get enough attention. Oh my God, should we talk about it more? And when I say we, I don't just mean like the body public or the body politic. I mean like each of your individual listeners in their daily lives should talk about climate change more often. Because there's this thing going on that social scientists refer to as pluralistic ignorance, where we all think that our friends and neighbors care less about climate change than is actually the truth. That makes us all sort of artificially quiet and silent about this issue that actually is more salient to our friends and neighbors than we think. And so, dear God, talk about it more. But you ask me whether it bothers me that talking about climate change and the environment isn't an effective strategy for engaging voters. And the answer to that question, Jason, is no, it doesn't bother me in the least. Because behavioral science tells us that the best way to get anybody to do anything is not to try to rationally convince them of the importance of that action. Instead, it's to appeal to them as social beings and use things like peer pressure to get them to vote. So even if people talked about environmental issues all the time, I still think the most effective way to get environmentalists to vote would be to still not talk about the environment, as weird as that sounds.
Nathaniel, I want to turn back to the difference between voter preferences and voter priorities, and the fact that very few likely voters hold climate as a top priority. Does that matter? In addition to increasing turnout of people who do prioritize the environment and climate, is it important to also get more people to actually prioritize these issues?
Absolutely. Because on both sides of the equation, whether you're a voter or a politician, you have limited bandwidth. If you're a voter, chances are you're not going to choose politicians based on 25 different factors that are precisely calculated to spit out the perfect candidate. Like, no, you're only going to be thinking about 2 or 3 things. And dear God, is it important that we make sure climate change is one of those 2 or 3 important things for as many voters as possible. But also on the other side of the ledger, for politicians, I would claim it's even more important. Because we often think of politics from the supply side of a marketplace, by which I mean we kind of think of politics as just like, you know what? Let's elect the right people and we'll get the right policy, right? If we put in the right people supplying policy, then, we'll get all the climate leadership we need. And I'm sorry, Jason, that's just not true. It's just not true. We can't ignore the demand side of the marketplace because even when we elect the so-called right people, it isn't like they can then just snap their fingers and get everything they want done. No, they still need to pick and choose what to spend their political capital on. And they are not going to spend it, I promise you, on the thing that only like 4% of voters list as their top priority. No way in hell. And until we build up voter demand for climate leadership, even the best politicians in the world aren't going to risk their political capital on something that the marketplace isn't demanding. And so, yeah, we need to dramatically increase the number of voters who don't just care about climate, but list it as a top priority so that even politicians who want to lead on climate all of a sudden start seeing that they have the political support to do what their heart is already telling them to do.
I'm sure there are folks that are listening, and we are just a couple months now from the election, and folks are wondering what can they do to help?
Well, thank you. Thank you for asking that question. That is always the question that the head of a nonprofit likes to hear. They can volunteer and donate. And oh my gosh, do we make it easy. So first, let me talk about volunteering. If you go to environmentalvoter.org, that's our website, environmentalvoter.org, we make it so easy to volunteer. You can click on the Get Involved tab and you can see dozens of opportunities almost every single day for you to call these voters or canvass these voters. And you click on a link and you RSVP and you'll get sent a Zoom link and you'll show up at the Zoom meeting and either a staff member or a trained volunteer will take all the time you need to get trained and comfortable with calling these voters. Your phone number won't show up, ours will, and so it's completely anonymous, and you'll be given a proven script that will increase turnout among these non-voting environmentalists. And what's even better is you won't be twisting anybody's arm. You're not trying to convince them to care about something they don't already care about. You're not trying to convince them to vote for someone they don't want to vote for. You're just trying to get somebody to start voting, which is a much, much easier ask. The second thing is, as I mentioned earlier, we still need to raise at least another $1.1 million to hit our budget. And we now have, I think we've gotten over 8,000 donations this year. And we would love people to join our family of donors. Donation of any amount makes a difference. And so please give generously. We are trying to execute on your values. If you are someone who cares deeply about building the political will to address the climate crisis, we have a lot of opportunities for you over the next 6 to 8 weeks.
Thank you, Nathaniel. We will make sure to include the link to your website in the show notes. A lot of folks feel small when it comes to volunteering. The idea of making phone calls or writing postcards, even knocking on doors, is just the sense of how many folks can I actually reach and does it make a difference? What do you say to those folks?
First, I say at the very sort of nitty-gritty level is that every time you volunteer with us, sometime a few hours later, but at the most a day later, you will get a report back from us letting you know how many people on your volunteer shift ended up reaching voters and what your total impact was. And so you will realize not just what you as an individual did, but what you as a collective with all of the people on your shift that evening did. And it will say, you called 50,000 people and you had conversations with 927 and 432 of them said they were going to vote. It really is a lot of nitty-gritty detail. So you will be able to see your impact and you'll be able to realize where you fit in as part of a collective. But on a broader sense, I will say, you're not alone. Everybody worries about enormous things like the democracy crisis and the climate crisis and the election. And when you join a group of people who share your concerns and you're all working together to try to make a difference, I'm not going to claim that your worries will disappear. Of course they won't. But I promise you'll no longer feel alone in worrying about them. Because you'll have the solidarity. It'll be right there staring you in the face when you see all these other people on the Zoom with you who have the same worries and are doing the same things. When you're facing enormous problems like this, one of the most powerful boosts you can give to yourself is that feeling of solidarity, that feeling of coming together with other like-minded people to try to do the same thing. It's a really special feeling, and I encourage you to find it, whether it's with the Environmental Voter Project or with some other group. Find it, because we all need that this fall. We all need that feeling. We deserve to feel it for ourselves.
Nathaniel, thank you so much for your time, the work that you're doing. All the best of luck to you.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you so much for this great conversation and this great podcast.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Invested in Climate. Please remember to rate us on Apple, Spotify, or Google. Find show notes, sign up for updates, get in touch, and visualize your climate action at investedinclimate.com. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute financial, accounting, or legal advice. Thanks again.